The medieval world lived beneath the shadow of God. From the humblest peasant who tilled the soil to the mightiest king who sat upon a golden throne, life was measured not only in days and years, but in the eternity that awaited beyond the grave. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone, their spires stabbing heaven as if to remind mortals that salvation was possible. Inside, stained glass burned with light, saints gazed down from painted walls, and choirs lifted voices that seemed to echo the very music of paradise. Faith offered beauty, hope, and the promise that life's sufferings were but a prelude to eternal joy. But the same God who promised heaven also threatened hell. Beneath the frescoes of angels, murals of demons writhed in shadow, clawing the damned into fire. Priests thundered from pulpits of the torments awaiting the sinful. Flames unending, chains unbreakable, screams eternal. Fear was etched into the very fabric of daily life. Fear of sin, fear of divine wrath, fear of the devil's whispers in the dark. If faith lifted men's eyes to heaven, fear chained their souls to the thought of hell. Together, they ruled hearts with a grip stronger than any king's decree. Imagine the life of a medieval villager. The harvest fails, and he wonders if God is punishing him for hidden sins. A neighbor dies suddenly, and whispers say it is the devil's work. At Sunday Mass, he kneels before the cross, comforted by the vision of Christ's mercy, but also terrified by the priest's warnings of eternal damnation for the unrepentant. Every prayer is a plea, every confession an escape from terror. Every candle lit a fragile act of hope against the vast darkness of divine judgment. Faith and fear were not separate forces, but twin currents, pulling and pushing the medieval soul. Faith bound communities together, pilgrimages to holy shrines, celebrations of feast days, the ringing of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. Fear, meanwhile, ensured obedience. The dread of excommunication, the terror of being cast out of the church, the gnawing belief that a single unconfessed sin could drag the soul into hell fire forever. Together, they formed the architecture of medieval spirituality, invisible yet towering over every choice. Kings and lords understood this balance. They ruled not only with armies, but with God's name upon their lips. To defy the crown was not only treason, but sin. To obey was not only loyalty, but piety. The Church itself mastered the art of wielding both forces, offering indulgences and blessings for faith, while brandishing curses and anathemas to enforce fear. Medieval man lived in a cage of contradictions, promised freedom in heaven, yet bound by obedience on earth. And yet there was beauty in this cage. The same faith that terrified also inspired. It built cathedrals, funded monasteries, and drove artists to carve visions of paradise in stone and glass. The same fear that enslaved also disciplined, giving order to a violent world where chaos always loomed. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in constant awareness of God's presence, whether as a gentle shepherd or a stern judge. So which was God's most powerful weapon in shaping the medieval world? Was it the radiant promise of heaven that drew men forward in hope? Or was it the dark specter of hell that kept them trembling in obedience? Was it faith that bound Christendom together, or fear that bent it to its knees? The answer is not simple, for both forces worked in unison, building an age where devotion and dread were indistinguishable. This is the dilemma we now enter. A world where every prayer carried both love and terror, where every cathedral was both a gate to heaven and a reminder of hell, and where God's greatest weapon may not have been one or the other, but the constant tension between the two. If fear was the chain that bound, Faith was the fire that warmed. For all the darkness that haunted the medieval imagination, the promise of heaven shone like a beacon across the centuries. In an age scarred by famine, plague, and war, faith offered more than consolation. It offered meaning. Suffering was not pointless if it led to paradise. Death was not an end if it was followed by eternal life. To believe was to step out of despair and into hope, to see beyond the misery of earth to the glory of heaven. The Church nurtured this faith with rituals that touched every stage of life. From baptism to burial, each sacrament was a stepping stone toward salvation. A newborn child, washed in holy water, was welcomed not just into the community of men, but into the family of God. A dying man, anointed with oil, was assured that heaven's gates would not close against him. Marriage, confession, communion, each carried the promise of grace, each a reminder that God had not abandoned his people. Faith was woven into the rhythm of existence, a comfort that life, however short or brutal, was part of a divine story. Pilgrimages embodied this yearning for heaven. Across Europe, men and women set out on long, perilous journeys to holy sites, convinced that each mile walked drew them nearer to God. The road to Santiago, the shrine of Thomas Becket, the tombs of apostles in Rome, each destination was not only a physical place, but a glimpse of paradise. Pilgrims returned with tokens, badges, relics, scraps of cloth that symbolized not only their travels but their faith. For them, God's presence was not distant but tangible, touchable, carried in their pockets and prayers. Cathedrals themselves were built as monuments to faith's promise. Their soaring arches, impossible heights, and radiant stained glass were designed to lift hearts heavenward. When sunlight poured through colored windows, transforming stone into kaleidoscopes of light, it was a foretaste of heaven itself. The faithful who stepped inside felt that they had crossed into another world, where earth and heaven met. To gaze upward at the vaults of Notre Dame or Chartres was to be reminded that God's promise was not abstract, but glorious and near. The saints, too, embodied this faith. Their lives told stories of devotion so intense that heaven itself seemed to break through their earthly bodies. Francis of Assisi, who embraced poverty and love, received the wounds of Christ upon his hands and feet, a sign that heaven's grace was real. Hildegard of Bingen, whose visions filled her with divine light, spoke of the harmony of creation and God's endless mercy. Their miracles, recorded and retold, reassured the people that faith could transform not only souls but bodies, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, even raising the dead. For kings and nobles, faith provided legitimacy. To rule was not only to wield power, but to act as God's chosen steward. Crowns were blessed, thrones sanctified, armies marched with relics before them. Yet even in their grandeur, rulers feared judgment, and so they built monasteries, endowed churches, and sought the prayers of monks to secure their souls. Faith was not only for peasants in their fields, but for kings in their palaces, a bond that united all under the same eternal hope. Even the smallest acts of devotion carried the weight of heaven. A peasant kneeling before a roadside cross, a widow lighting a candle for her dead husband, a child whispering the Lord's Prayer at night. These were not trivial gestures. They were acts of faith, each one a step toward salvation, each one infused with the promise that God's mercy was real. In a world where tomorrow was uncertain, such faith was not luxury, but necessity. And so faith lifted medieval Christendom, binding people together with the promise that life was not futile. Heaven waited. Eternal joy awaited. To live in faith was to believe that beyond the toil of the field, beyond the pain of sickness, beyond the terror of death itself, lay the radiant embrace of God. It was a vision that gave peasants courage, monks peace, and kings humility. If fear disciplined, faith inspired. If fear held, faith carried. In faith, medieval man saw not chains, but wings. If faith was the sweet promise that pulled souls toward heaven, fear was the iron chain that bound them in obedience. For the medieval imagination, hell was not a distant idea. It was a looming certainty for the sinful, a nightmare painted on the walls of churches and whispered in every sermon. Eternal fire, gnashing teeth, endless screams. These were not metaphors but realities that could seize the soul if one strayed from God's law. Priests wielded this fear with deliberate force. From the pulpit, they described the tortures awaiting the damned with detail sharp enough to sear the mind. Sinners would be boiled in pitch, gnawed by demons, frozen in ice, or burned without end. The church did not hide these horrors. It displayed them. Frescoes and carvings showed monstrous devils dragging souls into flames, angels weighing lives in fragile balances, and Christ seated as judge, his hand raised to bless the saved and condemn the lost. To enter a cathedral was to be reminded that salvation was a narrow gate, and damnation a pit yawning beneath one's feet. Excommunication was the most dreaded punishment of all. To be cut off from the church was to be cut off from God, doomed unless restored by confession and penance. Worse still were interdicts, when entire towns or kingdoms were denied the sacraments because of a ruler's disobedience. Imagine the terror of a village where no bells rang for Mass, no confessions were heard, no burials consecrated. Without the sacraments, heaven was closed. Fear drove peasants to plead with their lords to submit. Fear kept kings bending their knees to papal authority. Even in daily life, fear haunted every choice. A sudden death without confession meant the soul plunged into eternal torment. Missing Mass was no small oversight. It was rebellion against God. To lie, to steal, to lust, to covet. Each sin carried the weight of hellfire. Confessionals were filled not only with contrition, but with dread. A priest's words of absolution were like a key turning in the lock of hell's gate. Without them, the soul trembled on the brink. Visions of hell recorded by mystics reinforced this terror. Some claimed to have seen fiery pits where the proud were broken on wheels, the greedy forced to swallow molten gold, the lustful burned by flames of their own desire. These stories spread like wildfire, terrifying listeners into stricter devotion. The fear of demons lurking in shadows, waiting to snatch away the unwary, made every prayer, every sign of the cross, an act of desperate defense. But fear was not only spiritual, it was social. The Inquisition, armed with the power to expose heresy, wielded terror as a weapon. Accusations spread quickly, and even the innocent lived in dread that a careless word could be twisted into blasphemy. Public burnings seared the memory of fear into the crowd. A single spark was all it took to transform doubt into damnation. By fire, the Church reminded the world that disobedience to God meant not only eternal flames, but earthly ones too. And so fear disciplined Christendom. It made peasants obey priests, kings obey popes, and the faithful obey the endless rhythm of confession, penance, and prayer. It was not love of heaven alone that kept people within the fold, but dread of hell that drove them back whenever they strayed. In this way, fear was not merely an emotion. It was a system, a structure, a weapon as sharp and unyielding as any knight's sword. For medieval man, the cross carried both promise and threat. To reject it meant torment eternal, a destiny worse than death. And so faith inspired, but fear controlled. Which of these was stronger? For many, it was not the vision of angels that compelled obedience, but the nightmare of devils. God's mercy might be vast, but his wrath was closer, hotter, and far more terrifying. The medieval church understood its flock well. It did not rely solely on the warmth of faith, nor did it lean entirely on the cold grip of fear. Instead, it wove both together into a tapestry of authority that stretched from the humblest chapel to the grandest cathedral. Like a shepherd wielding both staff and rod, it offered the promise of heaven with one hand and the threat of hell with the other. To the faithful, this duality was not hypocrisy, but harmony. For God was both merciful Father and stern Judge. The sacraments embodied this balance most clearly. Baptism opened the gates of heaven, washing away original sin, but without it, the soul was thought condemned. Communion fed believers with the body of Christ, but to receive it unworthily was to risk damnation. Confession brought forgiveness, but refusal to confess meant carrying sins into eternity. Each sacrament was both gift and warning, a reminder that salvation was always within reach, yet always in danger of slipping away. Faith drew people towards the altar, but fear ensured they never strayed too far. Indulgences were another weapon in this balance. Preachers offered them as tokens of God's mercy, promising remission of punishment for sins. A donation, a pilgrimage, a crusade, each act could shorten the pains of purgatory, bringing the soul more swiftly to paradise. To give alms was an act of faith, but beneath it lurked the fear of purgatorial fire. The Church held the keys, and the faithful paid in coin, prayer, and obedience to unlock the gates of relief. Excommunication revealed the Church's power to wield fear directly. When kings defied papal authority, the threat of being cut off from the sacraments was enough to bring them crawling to their knees. Whole nations trembled under the weight of an interdict, where marriages could not be blessed, burials could not be consecrated, and Mass fell silent. The people, fearing for their eternal souls, often pressured rulers to reconcile. In this way, fear did not merely serve the Church's spiritual mission, it became a political weapon as sharp as any army's blade. But alongside this severity, the Church nurtured faith with tenderness. Monasteries welcomed the poor, hospitals cared for the sick, and priests guided their flocks with words of comfort as much as warning. Festivals lit the calendar with joy. Easter's resurrection, Christmas's hope, saints' feast days bursting with processions and music. These moments reminded the faithful that God's mercy was as real as his wrath, his love as present as his judgment. In the balance of fear and faith, hope always had its place. The Church also cultivated beauty as a tool of authority. Cathedrals with their stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts filled with radiant colors, chants that soared into the heavens, all of these were acts of persuasion, not through fear, but through awe. To stand within a Gothic nave was to be overwhelmed not by terror, but by wonder, to feel God's majesty in every stone and song. Faith was not only preached, it was seen, touched, and heard. This delicate weaving of faith and fear extended into the teachings of theologians. Augustine had reminded Christians that God was both just and merciful, that his punishments were real, but his forgiveness infinite. Aquinas later echoed this harmony, insisting that love of God was the highest calling, yet fear of punishment was a necessary beginning for those not yet strong in virtue. The Church did not pit faith against fear, but taught that both were steps along the same path. The trembling sinner could become the joyful saint. In this way, The medieval church maintained its authority not by choosing between faith and fear, but by mastering both. Hope without fear might have bred indifference. Fear without hope might have led to despair. Together they kept the faithful close, obedient, and devoted. For medieval Christendom, God was never only gentle nor only severe, he was both. And his church, standing as his steward on earth, ruled hearts and kingdoms alike through the careful balance of promise and warning, of heaven and hell. When Pope Urban II preached at Clermont in 1095, he lit a fire that swept across Europe, a fire fueled by both devotion and dread. He promised eternal rewards for those who marched to liberate Jerusalem, but he also warned of the perils of inaction, sins left unforgiven, salvation left uncertain. His words revealed the dual power of God's weapons. Faith inspired thousands to take up the cross, while fear drove them to believe they dared not refuse. For many nights, the crusade was framed as the perfect union of pilgrimage and holy war. On the one hand, it was an act of faith, to walk the long road eastward, endure hunger and hardship, and kneel at the sepulchre of Christ. On the other hand, it was an escape from fear, absolution promised for sins, freedom from the terror of hell. Men who had shed blood in feuds at home were told that if they shed blood in Jerusalem, heaven itself would wash them clean. The crusade was not only a journey across the earth, it was a journey away from damnation. The peasants who followed the banners of the great lords were no less moved by this duality. Some marched in faith, eager to see holy places they had only heard of in sermons. Others went out of fear, terrified that refusal would mark them as cowards in the eyes of both God and men. Preachers warned that to ignore the call was to risk one's soul, to stand idle while Christ's tomb lay in the hands of unbelievers. Faith promised glory, but fear compelled obedience. The imagery of crusade propaganda reflected this tension. Sermons spoke of Christ as both suffering Savior and avenging Judge. To march east was to defend his honor, but also to avoid his wrath. Illustrations showed the faithful knight carrying a cross on his shield and a sword in his hand, symbols of hope and terror fused together. Chroniclers described crusaders kneeling in tears before relics, then rising to storm cities with ferocity. For them, slaughter and sanctity were not contradictions, but two sides of the same divine command. The Crusade indulgences revealed the Church's mastery of this balance. A knight who joined was promised forgiveness of sins, not only for himself, but sometimes for his family. For the devout, this was an irresistible act of faith. But behind it loomed fear. To decline such a gift was to risk dying with sins unwashed, facing hell's flames with no shield. The promise of heaven and the fear of hell worked hand in hand, binding men to the cross as tightly as their armor bound them to the saddle. Yet, beneath the banners, doubt sometimes flickered. Did all crusaders march from love of God, or were many driven more by dread of sin and hunger for absolution? Chronicles reveal men who confessed to crimes before departing, as if the crusade were their last desperate chance to outrun damnation. Some lords forced vassals to join, turning the holy war into fearful obligation rather than chosen devotion. The line between faith and fear blurred until it was impossible to know which ruled hearts more strongly. For those who reached Jerusalem, the blend of the two forces was unmistakable. After years of hardship, when the Crusaders finally stormed the city, chronicles tell of streets running with blood. Yet once the slaughter was done, they fell to their knees in tears, praying before the sepulchre of Christ. The same men who had killed without mercy now wept with faith. Heaven and hell, devotion and dread, sword, and cross, all were entangled in the mystery of the crusade. Thus the Crusades became the greatest theater of medieval spirituality, where God's weapons of faith and fear were unsheathed together. Men were lifted by hope of paradise and bound by terror of damnation. Whether pilgrim or warrior, peasant or king, each crusader bore both wings of faith and chains of fear. And as they marched eastward, the question lingered. Did they walk more toward heaven's light, or away from hell's fire? When the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, faith and fear collided with a violence even greater than war. The plague did not distinguish between rich and poor, priest and peasant, saint and sinner. Whole villages vanished in days, cities were emptied, fields lay untended, and bells tolled ceaselessly for the dead. In such a world, the promises of heaven seemed desperately needed, yet the terrors of hell loomed closer than ever. God's weapons of faith and fear were unsheathed at once, cutting deeply into the hearts of medieval people. For some, the plague was a call to deeper devotion. Churches filled with trembling supplicants, praying for mercy. Pilgrimages multiplied as the faithful sought healing relics, miraculous shrines, or indulgences that might shield them from death. Priests offered absolution to the dying in streets thick with corpses, and many clergy themselves perished, martyrs to their duty. Faith became a desperate clinging to hope, that suffering had meaning, that heaven was near, that God's mercy would receive them when earthly life failed. Yet for others, the plague unleashed terror so profound it broke the bonds of society. Fear convinced many that the end of days had arrived. Preachers thundered that the pestilence was divine punishment for sin, proof that humanity had provoked God's wrath. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Neighbors turned on one another, scapegoating Jews, lepers, and strangers, accusing them of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil. Pogroms and massacres erupted, driven not by faith but by fear's violent frenzy. The flagellant movement embodied this darker side. Bands of men stripped to the waist, scourging themselves with whips as they marched from town to town, their backs raw with blood. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could appease God's anger and avert his plague. Crowds gathered to watch, some weeping in awe, others in terror, convinced these processions were the only hope left. Faith may have kindled their ritual, but fear was the lash that drove it. Art and literature of the time reflected this mingling of hope and dread. The danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared on church walls, showing skeletons leading kings, bishops, and peasants alike to the grave. The message was clear: no one escaped death, and all must prepare for judgment. At the same time, images of saints interceding for the faithful, of Mary spreading her cloak in mercy, reminded believers that heaven's protection was still possible. The medieval imagination oscillated between terror of damnation and yearning for salvation, unable to settle on one without the other. The institutional church itself struggled to maintain the balance. With so many clergy dead, sacraments were delayed or neglected. Some priests fled, abandoning their flocks, deepening the fear that God had forsaken them. Others stood firm, their courage strengthening faith even as death surrounded them. The papacy ordered processions and days of fasting, trying to channel fear into devotion. But the very scale of the catastrophe made many question: had God abandoned his people, or was this his final judgment? For ordinary men and women, life became a gamble between hope and horror. A mother nursing her child might whisper prayers of faith, yet tremble at every cough. A farmer burying his family might light candles for their souls, yet wonder if he too was damned. In every house, faith burned like a fragile flame, easily extinguished by the winds of fear. And yet, somehow, it endured, because without it, there was only despair. The Black Death revealed with brutal clarity how intertwined faith and fear were in medieval life. The plague strengthened devotion for some, unleashed hysteria in others, and left all convinced that God's hand was heavy upon the world. It showed that faith without fear lacked urgency, but fear without faith descended into chaos. In the pestilence, both weapons struck together, reminding Europe that salvation and damnation were never farther apart than a heartbeat. If the Black Death revealed fear's raw grip on the common people, kings and popes revealed how deliberately that fear could be harnessed. Power in the Middle Ages was never only about armies, castles, or coin. It was also about the soul, and to command souls, rulers wielded the most potent weapon of all, the fear of God. The papacy, above all, understood this. Excommunication was more than a spiritual sentence. It was political annihilation. A king placed outside the church was no longer God's anointed, no longer a rightful ruler in the eyes of his people. Subjects were released from oaths of loyalty, nobles from their duties, allies from their treaties. Fear of damnation translated into fear of rebellion. To be cast out of the church was to stand naked before both God and men, vulnerable not just to eternal fire, but to earthly ruin. No king dared risk it for long. Whole kingdoms felt this fear through the interdict, the papal thunderbolt that silenced bells, closed churches, and denied sacraments to all. Imagine a nation where no marriages were blessed, no burials consecrated, no mass celebrated. The living trembled for their salvation, and the dead lay in unconsecrated graves. This was not only punishment, it was terror on a national scale, a reminder that the Pope could bind or unbind heaven's gates with a word. Faith might inspire obedience, but fear ensured compliance. Kings, too, cloaked their power in divine threat. When monarchs levied taxes, demanded armies, or punished rebellion, they claimed to act with God's authority. To resist the king was to resist God. To obey him was to save one's soul. Royal propaganda cast wars as holy causes, rebels as heretics, enemies as cursed. Fear of eternal damnation was transmuted into fear of earthly punishment. A sword swung by a king was no mere blade. It was the arm of God. The clash between Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII during the investiture controversy revealed just how deeply fear shaped politics. When Gregory excommunicated the emperor, Henry's authority collapsed overnight. Nobles abandoned him, subjects deserted him, and his throne shook. Not because he had lost a battle, but because he had lost God's favor. The image of Henry kneeling barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging forgiveness, is more than an episode of humiliation. It is the triumph of fear. Even the most powerful man in Europe bowed before the terror of being cut off from heaven. But rulers were not mere victims of this weapon. They also turned it upon their people. English kings invoked God's curse on traitors. French kings wove divine justice into their law, and Spanish monarchs harnessed the fear of heresy to unify their realms. Each oath sworn, each law proclaimed, carried an echo of eternal consequence. To disobey was not just rebellion against the crown, but rebellion against the Almighty. Kings learned well that fear, sanctified by God's name, ruled more surely than the sword alone. Fear also played out in spectacle. Public punishments, burnings of heretics, or executions declared not only the power of king and church, but the fate of the soul. To see a heretic burn was to see a warning. Stray from the faith, and both body and soul would be consumed. Such spectacles taught the masses that obedience was salvation, and disobedience was fire. Faith whispered promises in churches, but fear shouted warnings in the marketplace. And yet, this wielding of fear came at a cost. Some obeyed outwardly, but simmered inwardly with resentment. Others turned cynics, seeing manipulation in every excommunication, politics in every sermon of wrath. Still, the strategy endured because it worked. Fear kept kingdoms stable, the faithful obedient, and rulers secure. Thus, the Middle Ages became a theater where kings and popes mastered the choreography of dread. With threats of hell, curses of heaven, and punishments both spiritual and temporal, they wielded fear as both weapon and shield. Faith might move hearts, but fear bent knees, and in bending knees, power was secured. Amid the thunder of sermons on hellfire and the shadow of papal threats, there arose voices of another kind, gentler, brighter, yet no less commanding. These were the mystics and saints, figures who did not wield fear but radiated faith. Their visions, their words, and their lives reminded medieval Christendom that God was not only judge and avenger, but also friend, lover, and shepherd. Where others ruled with dread, these souls inspired with love. Francis of Assisi embodied this spirit most purely. Born into wealth, he cast off his fine clothes to embrace poverty, declaring himself wedded to Lady Poverty in service of Christ. He preached not wrath, but joy, wandering barefoot, singing hymns, speaking to birds and wolves as though all creation were kin. For Francis, God's power was not in punishment, but in tenderness, his presence not in threats, but in the beauty of the sun, the moon, and the smallest sparrow. Crowds flocked to him, not out of fear of damnation, but out of longing for the faith he carried like fire in his heart. Hildegard of Bingen, cloistered yet luminous, spoke of God's glory in visions filled with light and color. She described the universe as a symphony, creation as a harmony, God as radiant brilliance that infused every living thing. She scolded rulers and rebuked corruption, yet her authority came not from invoking terror, but from revealing hope. In her music, her writings, and her visions, believers glimpsed a God of order and love, a creator who called his people not through fear of hell, but through the beauty of heaven. Catherine of Siena carried this same torch. In an age torn by schism and papal exile, she wrote letters to kings and popes, urging reform not with threats of wrath, but with appeals to Christ's mercy and compassion. She declared that God's love was a fire burning within the soul, urging sinners to repentance, not because they feared hell, but because they longed for union with Him. Catherine fasted, prayed, and suffered for her people, offering her own body as intercession. To follow her was to be drawn by love, not driven by dread. These mystics challenged the dominance of fear in subtle but powerful ways. Their lives suggested that holiness was not rooted in trembling obedience, but in radical trust, not in terror of damnation, but in the sweetness of God's grace. They were living witnesses that faith itself could be weapon enough, that love of God could command more loyalty than fear of punishment. Their miracles, healing the sick, calming storms, even raising the dead, were not threats but gifts, signs that heaven leaned close to earth. The people responded with fervor. Pilgrims thronged to the tombs of saints, carrying away not warnings of wrath, but tokens of mercy. Relics became treasures not merely because they warded off hell, but because they connected the faithful to the radiant love of those who had walked close with God. Feast days of saints filled towns with joy, processions celebrated their lives, and their stories spread like wildfire across Europe. In these saints, faith found its most compelling messengers. Even the institutional church recognized the power of these voices. Though wary at times, suspicious of visions and mysticism that skirted too near the edges of authority, the church canonized many saints, celebrating them as proof of God's mercy alive in human flesh. In doing so, it acknowledged that fear alone could not sustain Christendom. Hope was necessary, too. If dread kept men obedient, faith kept them inspired. In the quiet cloisters of Hildegard, in the dusty roads of Francis, in the fiery letters of Catherine, Europe heard another melody beneath the drum of fear, the song of love, the whisper of grace, the voice of faith. These saints did not deny God's wrath, but they proclaimed something greater, that His mercy was stronger. In them, medieval man found not chains of terror, but wings of devotion. For the kings and popes, for the saints and mystics, the question of faith and fear shaped their decisions and their destinies. But for the ordinary people of medieval Europe, the dilemma was lived daily, in the rhythms of work, worship, and survival. Every harvest, every birth, every death was entangled with God, and each moment brought the same haunting question. Should He be loved as a merciful Father, or feared as a relentless judge? The village church was the center of this struggle. On Sundays, peasants crowded under its stone roof, listening to sermons that mingled comfort with terror. One priest might speak of Christ's compassion, urging his flock to trust in His mercy. Another might thunder about hell's flames, warning of the devil lurking at the threshold of every soul. Children grew up with both messages carved into their hearts: God as gentle shepherd, and God as consuming fire. Faith gave them hope. Fear kept them vigilant. Daily life offered countless reminders of this duality. A farmer gazing anxiously at dark clouds might pray to God for rain in faith, believing the Creator cared for his fields. Yet if hail destroyed the crop, he might wonder if it was punishment for unconfessed sins. A mother, holding her newborn, would thank God with joy, but she also rushed to baptize the child, terrified that death before baptism meant eternal loss. Faith celebrated life, but fear stalked it at every turn. Festivals and feast days painted this paradox with vibrant colors. On Easter, bells rang in triumph, flowers decorated altars, and processions proclaimed Christ's victory over death. Joy swept through villages, reminding all that heaven's promise was near. Yet during Lent, the mood shifted. Penitence, fasting, ashes, and sermons on sin cast a shadow over daily life. The same church that lifted hearts with music and candles also brought them low with reminders of guilt. To live the medieval calendar was to live in constant oscillation between faith's joy and fear's burden. Merchants and townsfolk, rising in wealth, felt the dilemma in sharper ways. Prosperity was both blessing and temptation. Success in trade was praised as God's favor, yet greed was condemned as a sin that could damn the soul. To build a chapel or donate to a monastery was an act of faith. To hoard wealth was to risk eternal fire. Many balanced their lives carefully, spending their fortunes on altars, pilgrimages, and indulgences, trying to secure heaven's blessing while warding off hell's curse. Faith and fear guided even the weight of a coin. Nobles and knights, too, lived this paradox. On the battlefield, they prayed for God's protection, convinced their courage honored Him. Yet every drop of blood spilled haunted them with the fear of judgment. Many sought absolution before campaigns, confessing sins in case death came suddenly. Others, near the end of their lives, laid aside their swords for cloisters, trading the armor of steel for the habit of monks. Love of God had driven their valor. But fear of his judgment drove them at last to repentance. The family hearth was perhaps the truest arena of this struggle. Parents taught children prayers that spoke of God's mercy, but also bedtime warnings of hell to keep them obedient. A meal was blessed with gratitude, yet a failed crop was cursed with dread. Songs sung at weddings praised God's gifts, while dirges at funerals pleaded for his mercy. Every stage of life carried both light and shadow, laughter and trembling. God was never far, but his face was never wholly predictable. For the medieval people then, God was both beloved and feared, both gentle and terrible. They did not see contradiction in this duality. It was the nature of their world. To love without fear seemed naive. To fear without love seemed unbearable. So they lived with both, walking a narrow road where heaven and hell hung in the balance. Their dilemma was not solved, but endured, day after day, prayer after prayer, life after life. And so medieval man's heart was divided yet whole, pulled upward by faith's wings, and held down by fear's chains. Perhaps that was the truest devotion, to love God enough to hope in his mercy, and to fear him enough never to stray from his path. In this tension, the people of the Middle Ages found both their burden and their strength. From the glittering spires of cathedrals to the silent graves of plague-stricken villages, the Middle Ages was an age where God was never far away. His presence was sung in hymns, carved in stone, and thundered from pulpits. But his power was felt most keenly in the two forces that ruled the medieval soul, the radiant hope of faith and the chilling grip of fear. Each shaped lives, decisions, and destinies. And yet which was his most powerful weapon? Faith lifted hearts when the world seemed cruel. It built the cathedrals that still stand, inspired pilgrims to walk across continents, and gave peasants courage to endure hunger, war, and toil. It breathed through the lives of saints and mystics, filling their visions with light, their deeds with compassion, their deaths with meaning. Faith taught that life was not in vain, that every act of devotion drew the believer closer to heaven's eternal joy. Without it, medieval man might have sunk into despair, but fear was never silent. It echoed in sermons of fire and torment, in the crackling of pyres where heretics burned, in the tolling bells of a kingdom under interdict. Fear bound rulers to popes, peasants to priests, and sinners to confession. It kept the fragile order of Christendom intact when chaos threatened to rip it apart. If faith gave wings, fear gave walls. It was fear that compelled obedience when love alone was not enough. Fear that kept men trembling within the bounds of God's church. The two were not rivals, but partners. Faith inspired great deeds. Fear restrained rebellion. Faith gave sweetness to devotion. Fear gave urgency to repentance. Together they formed the twin edges of a sword sharper than any knight's blade, wielded not by kings or popes alone, but by the very idea of God that dominated the age. Neither could exist without the other. Hope without dread risked indifference. Terror without mercy risked despair. It was in their tension, in their constant pull, that medieval spirituality found its power. And yet, as centuries passed, questions arose. Did rulers and priests wield fear too eagerly, turning God's mercy into a weapon of control? Did faith shine brightly enough to outweigh the darkness of manipulation and violence? Was God truly the wielder of these weapons, or had men forged them in his name? Medieval man did not resolve these questions, but he lived them, day by day, breath by breath. For in the end, Perhaps God's greatest weapon was not faith or fear alone, but the unresolvable struggle between them. It was in that struggle that cathedrals were built, saints were born, kings were humbled, and empires rose and fell. The medieval soul was shaped by hope of paradise and dread of damnation, carried forward by the promise of mercy and restrained by the terror of judgment. To live in that world was to live always in the shadow of eternity. So, was God's most powerful weapon faith or fear? The answer lies not in choosing one, but in recognizing that the two were inseparable. Faith lifted, fear constrained. Faith inspired, fear compelled. Together they ruled the Middle Ages with an authority no earthly ruler could rival. And perhaps that was the true genius of medieval Christendom. It taught its people to walk not in certainty, but in tension, between heaven and hell, between mercy and wrath, between love and terror. And even now, centuries later, when we look upon the soaring arches of a cathedral or the grim frescoes of the Last Judgment, we are reminded of the question that haunted every medieval soul. Does God rule us more by the promise of His love or by the shadow of His wrath? The answer, like the Middle Ages itself, remains suspended between light and darkness.